In Word and Object, published in 1960, W.V.O. Quine asks us to picture a traveler among speakers of an unfamiliar language. A rabbit runs past. One of the speakers points toward it and says, "Gavagai." The traveler has no bilingual dictionary, no grammar book, and no trusted guide to explain the scene. There is only the rabbit, the gesture, the sound, and the speaker's visible response. What is at stake is whether this apparently simple encounter can ever yield one uniquely correct translation. The traveler might write rabbit beside Gavagai. That seems natural. A rabbit was present, the speaker responded, and the word appeared to mark the animal, but the evidence is thinner than it first appears. The speaker might have been responding not to the whole animal, but to an undetached rabbit part, or to a temporal stage of a rabbit. The rabbit as it exists at that moment, rather than as a persisting creature. The same outward scene can support more than one proposed meaning. Quine calls this setting radical translation. Radical translation is interpretation from observable behavior and circumstances alone. The translator begins without a pre-existing bridge between the two languages. This is not merely a practical difficulty, like lacking enough vocabulary. It is a question about what could settle the matter even if the translator observed indefinitely many speakers, situations, gestures, and responses. That question has an older shape. Around the 4th century before the Common Era, Plato staged a dispute about names in the Cratylus. Hermogenes defended the view that names depend on convention. Cratylus defended the view that names possess a natural correctness. One side treats a word as something a community settles upon. The other treats it as an attempt to fit the thing itself. Quine's traveler, standing before the rabbit, inherits that dispute without knowing it. The next problem is whether Plato's argument about natural and conventional names can establish what kind of correctness a name could have. Plato's Cratylus is centered on a basic question: are names correct by nature or by convention? Hermogenes holds that a name is correct because speakers use it. On this view, there need be no special bond between a sound and the thing named. A community could employ one sound rather than another, and the name would work because its users treat it as the name. Cratylus presses in the other direction. A name, on his view, is not simply an agreed signal. It should somehow track the nature of what it names. The idea is demanding. If names are naturally correct, then a name can be more or less adequate to its object for reasons beyond what a community happens to accept. Socrates examines both positions. He takes seriously Cratylus's thought that names might reveal something about things. He also takes seriously Hermogenes' insistence that language involves shared practice. But the dialogue does not end by providing a simple rule according to which every name gains its correctness from natural resemblance. The relation between a name and a thing remains unstable. A word may be used by convention, yet speakers may also expect it to answer to the world. That instability matters for the rabbit scene. If Hermogenes is right, Gavagai might mean whatever the community has established it to mean, but the traveler still needs access to that establishment. If Cratylus is right, the word may contain a clue to the rabbit's nature, but the traveler still needs a way to identify that clue. Neither answer simply turns pointing into translation. The strongest objection to a theory based only on public behavior exists, and it will be faced later when language learning enters the argument. For now, Quine makes the pressure sharper by claiming that even complete behavioral evidence may not decide between rival manuals. In Word and Object, Quine's imagined utterance, Gavagai, occurs when a rabbit is present. The obvious translation is rabbit, but Quine argues that other translations can fit the available behavioral evidence as well. Gavagai could mean an undetached rabbit part. It could mean a temporal stage of a rabbit. Each proposal organizes the observed scene differently, but none need conflict with the visible patterns on which the radical translator relies. This is Quine's indeterminacy of translation. Indeterminacy of translation is the thesis that behavioral evidence may fail to determine one uniquely correct manual of translation. A manual of translation is not merely a list matching isolated words. It is a systematic way of connecting one language to another. Quine's point is that rival systems can preserve the same observable responses while assigning different structures to what speakers are said to mean. The force of this claim is easy to miss. Quine is not saying that translation is impossible. The traveler can produce a workable manual. The manual can guide interaction, prediction, and further interpretation. The problem is that usefulness does not establish uniqueness. Two manuals may work equally well while disagreeing about whether the speaker refers to rabbits, rabbit parts, or rabbit stages. This argument belongs to Quine's broader rejection of a sharp analytic synthetic distinction, which he defended in Two Dogmas of Empiricism in 1951. The analytic synthetic distinction separates truths held to depend on meanings alone from truths held to depend on facts about the world. Quine rejects a clean boundary of that kind. His translation argument carries the same suspicion into the relation between words and evidence. We may want meaning to supply a fixed structure beneath use, but observable evidence does not obviously force one structure rather than another. But there is a problem with this argument. If translation is always underdetermined by behavior, then ordinary communication seems to depend on an unexplained success that Donald Davidson tries to account for. Donald Davidson develops Radical Interpretation in Radical Interpretation, published in 1973. Like Quine's radical translator, Davidson's interpreter begins without a ready-made translation key. The task is to interpret speakers through their behavior in a shared environment. But Davidson resists the picture of interpretation as a cold inventory of stimulus and response. His central tool is the principle of charity. The principle of charity requires an interpreter to maximize agreement and rational coherence when interpreting another speaker. This does not mean treating everyone as correct about everything. It means that interpretation must begin from the assumption that speakers are broadly responsive to the same world and broadly intelligible within it. Without that assumption, the interpreter could always assign bizarre meanings and irrational beliefs to every utterance. Interpretation would cease to get started. Return to Gavagai. Davidson does not simply declare that it must mean rabbit. Rather, he asks what interpretation gives the speaker a coherent place in a shared world. A speaker who regularly responds in rabbit-present circumstances must be understood as tracking something that others can also identify and discuss. Interpretation is constrained not just by behavior, considered as a pattern, but by the demand to make a speaker largely truthful and rational in relation to a common environment. In Thought and Talk, published in 1975, Davidson argues that thought depends on triangulation. Triangulation is the relation among speakers and a shared world that makes thought possible. A speaker is not merely attaching private labels to private experiences. The speaker's utterances are answerable to objects and events that other speakers can also encounter. This challenges the image of language as a private set of labels pasted onto experience. Davidson does not erase Quine's challenge. There can still be more than one way to formulate an interpretation, but he changes what counts as the central constraint. The interpreter is not selecting labels in a vacuum. The interpreter is locating another person within a world both parties inhabit. Yet Davidson's appeal to public coherence leaves a hard question untouched. Can publicly observable dispositions really supply the full basis for the linguistic capacities that speakers acquire? Noam Chomsky's criticism begins with behaviorism. In a review of B.F. Skinner's Verbal Behavior, published in 1959, Chomsky criticizes behaviorist accounts of language. His argument is not that observable behavior is irrelevant. Speakers plainly do speak, respond, correct themselves, and learn from others. His objection is that behavior alone does not explain the competence that language users come to possess. Chomsky argues that children acquire linguistic competence from input that underdetermines the grammar they come to know. Underdetermines means that the available input does not by itself fix the full grammar acquired. The child reaches a capacity for language that exceeds what can simply be read off from the publicly available examples and corrections. In Knowledge of Language, published in 1986, Chomsky treats linguistic knowledge as constrained by features of the human mind. The claim shifts the location of the explanation. Quine asks what a translator can infer from observable dispositions. Chomsky asks what internal capacities make it possible for a child to acquire language from limited input. The two questions overlap, but they are not identical. This is the strongest resistance announced earlier. If Quine relies on publicly observable dispositions as the full basis for translation, Chomsky argues that the basis is incomplete. The translator may observe use, but use is made possible by linguistic capacities that do not appear merely as a list of observed responses. A theory that leaves those capacities out may describe the surface of linguistic practice while missing the conditions that make learning possible. The objection does not restore a natural correctness of names in Cratylus' sense. Chomsky's point, as presented here, is not that each word resembles its object by nature. It is that language cannot be understood only as a public pattern from which meaning is inferred. The human mind constrains what can be learned and known. This creates a new test for translation technology. Useful systems must operate on public language, yet their success is judged amid the same plurality of contexts and equivalents that Quine made visible. In June 2024, Google announced that Google Translate would add 110 languages. Google stated that the expansion used its Palm 2 large language model. The announcement concerns an ordinary technological task, carrying a sentence from one language into another in a way that people can use. But the philosophical problem has not disappeared inside the machinery. A translation system must produce some output. That output may be useful, fluent, and appropriate to a context. Yet usefulness is not the same as discovering one uniquely correct pairing between every expression and every meaning. The system operates within patterns of community use. It must handle context. It must treat some formulations as equivalent enough for the purpose at hand. Those are not trivial engineering details. They are choices about what translation is supposed to preserve. Machine translation systems are commonly evaluated with reference translations. A reference translation is a human-provided target rendering used as a standard for comparison. One widely used approach is the Bell-U metric, introduced by Kishore Papineni and colleagues in 2002. Bell-U compares a system's output with reference translations. This gives evaluation a concrete basis. It makes it possible to assess outputs against translations that have already been accepted for the task. But a reference translation can be useful while allowing multiple acceptable translations of the same source sentence. This is not a failure of evaluation. It is a reminder of its limits. A system may differ from one reference while still producing an acceptable translation. Another system may match the reference closely while missing a relevant context. The standard helps, but it does not turn translation into a single fixed correspondence between sentences. Google Translate's expansion therefore places Quine's problem in a modern form. The system needs decisions about context, community use, and equivalence in order to be useful across languages. Davidson explains why shared coherence and a common world matter. Chomsky explains why public behavior may not exhaust the capacities involved in language. Quine remains present in the gap between a translation that works and a translation that can be shown to be uniquely required. As automated translation reaches more language communities, what should count as an equivalent translation when more than one rendering serves the shared world well? Subscribe for more philosophy in the systems we use every day.